Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 15 of Series 8. The question for today is, can information exist in the world independently of the mind? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 6, Section 11. So this series of workshops is about mind or consciousness as a precondition of a philosophy of life and value. That is, the principle of the affirmation of value, the will to value, or the value of value. Underlying that principle is the fact that value is essential to activities like ethics, meaning, and purpose. At a deeper level, value can be shown to be a constituent of consciousness. So understanding the character of consciousness is essential to this account. We have previously approached understanding consciousness in a number of ways. These have included different theories of consciousness like physicalism, dualism, and functionalism. We have looked at schools of thought like phenomenology, existentialism, and Buddhism. Issues about consciousness have included free will, objective knowledge, and mysteriousness. Today we are asking whether information exists in the world independently, or is it a product of consciousness? The usual view is that information does exist in the world independently in the form of facts and data. But data is thought of as hard facts, statistics, and numerical quantification used in an analysis. So the question is, does information or facts or data exist objectively, independently of the mind? This question is also subject to the nominalist, realist, and objective subjective debates that we must examine. An early form of the debate goes back to John Locke in the 17th century. Locke distinguished independent or primary qualities from secondary or subjective qualities. Independent primary qualities are solidity, extension, figure, mobility, and number. Secondary qualities are produced by us, like colours, sounds, and tastes. Locke's primary qualities might be thought to support the idea of objective features or properties of the world. But the solidity of matter is challenged by a conception of matter as interacting particles or energy. Spatial extension and motion are subject to relativity theory, and number can be questioned by anthropocentric theories of mathematics. The objectivity of mathematics seems to be more secure than the objectivity of information. We will discuss the objectivity of mathematics next week. Yet even Kant considered space and time to be products of the mind, explained in terms of number. And thinkers like Heidegger and Wittgenstein hold anthropocentric theories of mathematics. But the secondary quality of colour is universally accepted by philosophers and psychologists as a product of mind. This is the case because humans and different animals have different colour perceptions of the world. But none of them is true, indicating that colour isn't in the world but is a product of the mind. Yet what we are discussing today is the much more contentious issue of, does information exist independently in the world? But to answer that question, we must first ask the question, what does information consist in? We should first consider information in the form of stateable propositions or sentences. Yet there is a deep controversy over the objective meaning of propositions. Take the example of the statement, Mary had a little lamb. Did she have one as a pet, give birth to one, or had some for breakfast? The answer to this question cannot be derived from the statement itself. The answer must be derived from the observer's understanding of the statement, and from the context. But it might be objected that we need to include the totality of the context in which the statement was made. Yet this context would have to include every possible observer in every possible interpretation, such as, was it a lamb or a sheep? Was it breakfast or brunch? Extending into infinity. This example shows that meaning, in this case, isn't found in the statement itself, but is externally attributed. But it might be objected that the meaning of sheep, or more interestingly Mary, is fixed and objective. And statements of scientific fact are stronger examples of independent or objective meaning. But standard problems of vagueness, ambiguity, and value-ladenness also affects science. And two challenges to the idea of independent or objective meaning also come from Wittgenstein and postmodernism. Wittgenstein proposed the widely accepted use or complex theory of contextual meaning. This argues that epistemic meaning isn't fixed, but is determined by usage and context. Postmodernism also rejects epistemic certainty, the univocity of meaning, and the underlying concept of universal truth. Jacques Derrida, for example, deconstructs language, of which he holds the meaning is undecidable and subjective. He famously claimed that there is no outside text or outside authority that can impose meaning. That is, the text is not only open to interpretation, but radical interpretation almost without limit. But this seems to be implausible, especially with factual or scientific texts. Yet one well-known advocate of this postmodern view of meaning is Nietzsche, which can also be criticized. He wrote that there are no facts, only interpretations, and he also wrote that facts do not exist, only interpretations. But in criticism of this postmodernist view of meaning, we can claim that there are limits to interpretation. That is, all interpretation takes place in context, which must have references to boundaries of meaning. They are bounded by intelligibility, circumstance, and the concepts at our disposal. For example, a medieval monk could not think about computers or quantum theory. But more pointedly, Whitehead and Russell replaced natural language with logical symbols for this reason. That is, symbolic logic was constructed to avoid the vagueness and ambiguity of natural language. But the accepted limitation of symbolic logic was its very limited range of meaning. Yet we can still ask whether symbolic language has meaning in itself, independently of mind. Symbolic logic expresses values such as negation, implication, logical equivalence, conjunction, disjunction, and biconditionality. But some logical values seem to be more objective than others. So we are using the word value here as a logical feature, not subjectively as I often use it. Yet the question now is whether logical values are independent of mind, or are they anthropocentric constructs? One way to look at this is to consider such values above, like negation, equivalence, and conjunction, as functions of contrast, which I have previously argued to be a product of consciousness. I usually do this with the idea of a white spot on a white board, which thereby can't be seen. It can't be seen because it needs a contrast like a black spot on a white board. Such contrast is a necessary requirement of cognition and thereby also of consciousness. Further, this is because cognition is a necessary requirement of consciousness. This can be argued on the axiom shared by both analytic and continental philosophy that consciousness is conscious of something, and on this view, a brain in a vat could not be conscious. I also often make this point that contrast is foundational to consciousness with the help of Sartre. Freedom and choice are basic to existentialist and Sartre's thought that Sartre traces to consciousness. He makes a close identification between choice and consciousness that he expresses by saying choice and consciousness are one and the same thing, and that every choice supposes elimination and selection, and thereby also contrast. Yet Sartre goes further to make the phenomenon of choice as selection an ontological property of consciousness. He writes that choice isn't just a preference, but a selection traced back to its ontological foundation. These are arguments to show that contrast is a fundamental property of consciousness rather than of the world, and the same can be thereby said of logical values as properties of consciousness. I can also briefly note that the same arguments to establish the foundations of subjective value, and that this might be a further reason to take logical values to be subjective. We have just considered the possibility of a subjective basis for logical values as a function of contrast. But symbolic logic and logical values are accepted as having a narrow and a restricted meaning. So I want to consider some of the broader basic elements of information. These seem to include notions like quantity, quality, negation, affirmation, existence, and non-existence. These are in addition to logical values like validity, relation, equivalence, and true and false. But these ideas intuitively seem to have been anthropocentrically constructed. The idea of quality, for example, is a deeply subjective property, and even quantity appeals to human systems and criteria of assessment. Although Immanuel Kant is considered a rationalist, his views support the case for subjectivity here. Kant's Copernican revolution was, for example, the first to recognize the active role of mind in perception. His view was so strong on this that he maintained that time and space were produced by perception. Yet both Kant's view on this and interpretations of it are, however, contentious. But more specific to the subjectivity or objectivity of information, Kant posits 12 categories of understanding, and these 12 categories can be compared to the basic units noted above of either logic or information. Kant presents these 12 in the 4 classifications of quantity, quality, relation, and modality. The 12 categories of understanding in which human thought must be expressed are as follows: unity, plurality, totality, reality, negation, limitation, subsistence, causality, and community, including possibility or impossibility, existence or non-existence, and necessity and contingency. It takes time to think about these categories of thought, but there are a few things that we can say about them now. One is that they bear a similarity to logical values, which tells us about his ideal patterns of thought. Another is that his notion of quality is quite unvalent and binary, and similarly his notion of quantity lacks degrees of graduation. In my view, these limitations translate into his ethical and other philosophies that I find to be one-dimensional. But the point here is that he presents normative categories of thought that are nevertheless subjective. That is, categories of thought and time and space are subjective perceptions produced by an observer, and as such they constitute an argument against the objective independence of information. Kant's account is a sophisticated yet nascent version of the view that consciousness creates reality. Yet further to the problem of consciousness creating properties that are mistakenly projected onto the world, there is another problem of not only overlooking consciousness that we have discussed, but the difficulty of what exists or doesn't exist in the absence of consciousness. I previously argued that there's a deep problem of the neglect and self-obfuscation of consciousness. Yet an appreciation of the absence of consciousness is more problematic than the neglect of its presence. Numerous examples of this kind of misunderstanding can be found in human life. One is the difficulty that some people have in understanding death as the end or absence of consciousness. Another is found in the false ascription of consciousness to inanimate objects or AI devices. Another is the projection of subjective value onto the world as objective value. One instance of this is a belief in the intrinsic value of physical objects, and we can ask whether this tendency is also present in science. One example is the failure to see science as value-laden. The suggestion here is that information might also be mistakenly seen as having an objective existence. On this view, information could simply be absent with an observing consciousness to sustain its existence. But Giulio Tononi's integrated information theory opposes the view that consciousness produces information. That is, integrated information theory holds that consciousness is identical to a certain kind of information, and that kind of information requires physical, not just functional integration. And moreover, this kind of information can be measured mathematically. Integrated information theory thereby attributes an independent and objective status to information. But this theory has both physicalist and cognitive suppositions that can be contested. That is, cognitivist accounts may be successful in explaining certain aspects of consciousness, but they had difficulty explaining phenomenal aspects of felt experience like affect, will and value. Ned Block, for example, holds that perceptual consciousness overflows cognitive access. But an even more problematic claim for information theory is that information is identical to consciousness. This claim may be more credible than the claim that consciousness is identical to physical brain states, yet it still has difficulty explaining phenomenal felt experience. A more technical objection to information theory's mathematical quantification is posed by Scott Aronson. Aronson points to the fact of more complex computational processes than humans that aren't conscious. This is a reductio ad absurdum argument that I'm not going to discuss in detail here. Yet David Chalmers employs information perhaps more credibly as a precondition of consciousness. Chalmers uses the property of information as an intermediary step between physicality and consciousness. This would make a continuous and unbroken transition from physicality to consciousness. And this would link consciousness to the physical world in the process of natural development. But Chalmers goes further to state that wherever there is causal interaction, there is also information. And wherever there is information, there is experience. That is, conscious experience. Yet Chalmers goes on to give this his infamous example of conscious thermostats, and he writes that if there is experience associated with thermostats, there is probably experience everywhere. John Searle finds this absurd, and it is absurd. Thermostats are not conscious, and I have previously argued against the panpsychism implied in Chalmers' account. Yet more relevantly for us, Searle takes issue with Chalmers' ambiguous use of information. That is, in both standard and the extended sense, where rain hitting the ground can also contain information. But this isn't the kind of information that either contains data or is a precondition of consciousness. So there seems to be several things wrong with Chalmers' account of information. One is his implausible panpsychist account of consciousness. Another is his anthropomorphic and mistaken use of information. This leaves us with information as a product rather than a precondition of consciousness, and this conclusion does not amount to an argument for the independent existence of information. Yet we must consider more factual examples of information existing independently in such as computers. It seems almost inconceivable that computer software doesn't contain programmed information. But such systems require human beings to feed in the information and receive it afterwards. Without human oversight, we could say that there wouldn't be any information at all. There would only be the whirring of binary inputs and outputs. Searle makes the point when he writes that it is essential to our conception of a digital computer that its operations can be specified purely formally. And he goes on to say that the symbols have no meaning. They have to be specified purely in terms of their formal or syntactic structure. That is to say, computer processes have no meaning or information in themselves. They are just conveyors of information that is apprehended by human beings. Yet this extraordinary view has parallels with other cases of apprehended reality. The most basic example is that of colour, apprehended by humans and animals, but not existing in the world. Another example is indeterminacy in quantum physics, that events can't be quantified until perceived. A more contentious yet illustrative example is the postmodernist view that texts do not contain their own meaning, but is brought to them by the reader. These arguments may be thought of as part of the devastating critique advanced by postmodern thought. That is, information isn't part of the external physical world, but is produced by the observer or the reader. But postmodernism is at its weakest in its criticisms of science, and in this respect we should consider DNA as independently existing information. And DNA indisputably exists and is essential to the development and continuance of life. On that view, DNA would provide the information required for those objective outcomes. DNA does produce definite and distinctive results, yet because that process can be variously described and interpreted in different ways by different theories, we might not be justified as describing that process as conveying information. This is because information must be described as being factual, but the core meaning of facts is not thought to be subject to interpretation. As stated by Nietzsche's "There are no facts, only interpretations." Moreover, we can explain how non-factual of prefactual processes can have objective or normative outcomes. We can do this by comparisons with the pragmatic outcomes of prefactual processes like colour. That is, as above, colour is indisputably subjective and accords with particular species or individuals. But different colour experiences enable different creatures to navigate the world perfectly well. This is because they are interpreting the world pragmatically according to their different needs. I believe that we can say the same thing about different scientific interpretations of DNA. But I want to consider one more specific argument against this contentious view that I'm advancing. It is the view that information isn't objective in the sense of existing independently of our minds. The argument is the view of the physicalist Brian Cox and others that, according to the laws of nature that we have, information is conserved in the universe. And on this view, a destroyed book, for example, could in principle be reconstructed. That is, if every particle, quantum of radiation and photon could be collected. But Cox himself presents a problem for this possibility. That is that black holes, quantum mechanics and general relativity together erase information. He tells us that this is called the black hole information paradox. So in this view, information does not exist and can't continue to exist independently of the mind. Daniel Dennett interestingly agrees that information is neither matter nor energy. My conclusion is that information does not exist independently of our minds. But I have not yet considered mathematics as the most objective form of information that we know of. I will examine mathematics as well as explanations of both life and physics next week. Yet today we have examined both subjective and objective accounts of information. Objective accounts of information included objective properties of the world like Locke's primary qualities. We also considered symbolic logic, Kant's categories and integrated information theory. With respect to science, we looked at computer data, DNA and conservation of information. All these considerations support the intuition that information does exist independently in the world. But we considered a number of philosophical arguments against this intuitively compelling view. One was the subjectivity of qualities like colour and the anthropocentricity of facts and meaning. A simple example was the multiple meanings of Mary had a little lamb. Yet postmodernism offers a more sophisticated critique of objective meaning. But my underlying interest in questioning the objectivity of information lies in explicating consciousness. That is, in this series of workshops, I'm examining the character and the creative power of consciousness. And I'm asking whether consciousness has the capacity to create the contents of information, or whether information exists in the absence of consciousness. One of the ways that I did this was to reductively examine basic units of data and of symbolic logic. I argued that these basic units can be understood more fundamentally in terms of contrast, and that contrast itself can only be understood as a fundamental structure of consciousness. Therefore, basic units of data are products of consciousness, and therefore information doesn't exist independently of the mind. I also looked at the neglect of consciousness and the neglect of its absence as a supplementary argument. Then the absence of information in the absence of consciousness is even more likely to be overlooked. but we have not yet considered the hardest case of mathematics and number that we'll look at next week. So let me have your comments and criticisms at the meeting or on websites like Zoom or meetup.com.